Hi, everyone. Welcome to Coding with Nylas. So I'm going solo today. I think Blog could not make it. He was having some connection issues. So my name is Ram. I'm a developer advocate at Nylas, and I'm excited to jump into today's topic. So for the month of Feb, or at least for the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about all things API v3. So this is our latest API that we just launched. So there's a blog post below on introducing the Nylas API v3. And we're going to cover a topic that's going to be really useful for developers, especially in the JavaScript ecosystem. And this is going to be useful when you're migrating between different versions of an SDK or a Node SDK. And we're going to go through how to build with Nylas using TypeScript. So TypeScript is very powerful. I like to think of it as a representation of JavaScript with syntax. So it's an abstraction of JavaScript with additional syntax for types. And this is really important when you're working with other developers and you're able to communicate the shape of data. And that's what types does for you, where you can actually statically type all the information that's passed through an application. And then from there, it's easier for any other developer to pick up and understand how to actually work with your piece of code. And the same thing applies for SDKs as well. When you're looking to work with an SDK and you haven't worked with a developer or look at the documentation, you can quickly pick up what's needed to actually get started and start using that actual SDK. So we talked a bit about TypeScript, and that's going to be part of what we do in this live stream. And I also want to highlight what the Nylas APIs allow you to do. So Nylas APIs are for email, calendar, and contacts. So anytime you want to integrate with and connect with your users' communication data, that being email, calendar, and contacts, you can use the Nylas APIs to complete what I like to call like CRUD-like functionality. So you can create, read, update, and delete any one of your users' email, calendar, and contacts once you've connected to their, for example, Google account. And you can do that through the actual Nylas API. So it's one API that allows you to integrate with any type of information provider or communication provider, email provider like Google or Microsoft. So before we jump in, I'm going to ask that you all like and subscribe. We do these live streams twice a week right now, and we don't have an exact schedule. So we love if you can follow along so you can catch up to all the latest and greatest and get updated when we actually have a live stream going out or when we have an upcoming live stream, so you can kind of tune in. So let's go ahead and talk about the Node Nylas or the Nylas SDK. So with the launch of the Nylas API for v3, we've actually updated and revamped all of our SDKs, including the Node SDK. So what we're going to do in this actual live stream or in the next few steps, we're going to look at migrating a code sample from v2 to v3. And the example we're going to look at is retrieve calendars or retrieving calendars. So you can get a list of all your calendars, you can view all your calendars, and you can decide what you want to do with them, whether you want to create events on those calendars and whatnot. So the first step is let's kind of start with the Node SDK for API v2. So I'm going to share my screen that we can quickly get started taking a look at this code. So I'll go through the code first. I'll run the code. I think this is something we've covered in past live streams, but I want to start with this first, and then we can jump from there. So let me share my screen. And from here, let's actually take a look at the actual code. So yeah, okay. So here is what the code looks like using the actual Nylas Node SDK for API v2. So here we have importing our environment variables, and then we have the actual Node library, or sorry, the Nylas library being imported, and then we're configuring our .env so we can access environment variables that we've set up. And I can quickly show you what those look like over here. So here we have our different environment variables, and I've labeled them based off of the different versions of the Nylas API. So the top three are the one that we're going to be using for v2. So this is going to be the client ID, the client secret, and as well your user's access token. So the first two you can grab from the actual v2 dashboard. And the last one is going to be anytime you connect a user account, you'll get the access token to be able to retrieve the information for the user. So these are the variables that we're passing in here. So first we're passing in the client ID and the client secret. And this is going to allow us to actually configure our Nylas client. So once we have it configured, we're going to go ahead and retrieve the first 5 calendars, and we're going to console log that out. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that in the actual terminal so I can show you what that looks like. So here, let me see if I'm sharing my full screen. There we go. Let me just go back to full screen. So right now we have everything installed. So I've gone ahead and installed the actual package.json for the Nylas SDK. And we also have the index.js. So we're just going to run index.js. And this is going to use the actual V2 APIs to retrieve a list of calendars. So you can see here are the list of calendars, and they're set up based off of how the actual Node SDK for V2 works, where you have all these different models that you can go through and search through. And what I want to do next is I actually want to start migrating over to V3. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at getting started with TypeScript. So if we take a look at the code, so I'm just going to show you the actual Explorer or the file Explorer. Right now we have index.js, and then we have I've gone ahead and put in the types for any global environment variables that we're going to use. So I've defined the types of these as all strings. So what we're going to do next is we're actually going to go ahead and convert this to a TypeScript file. And then from there, so let me do that now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to convert this to a TypeScript file. And then I'm going to actually install TypeScript. So I'm going to bring in TypeScript into this project, and you may already have TypeScript in your project. So maybe, so this is more so just adding TypeScript to your application. So let me clear the terminal. Let me just zoom in a bit. There we go. And I'm going to type, let me just move this up a little bit. There we go. So here I'm going to type first, I'm going to npm install TypeScript. And since TypeScript, you can probably install this as a developer package instead. I don't think you need this as a top level package. So we're going to save it as a developer package. And the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to instantiate our configuration. So anytime you have TypeScript in a project, you need to actually create a configuration for that. So we're going to use the actual TypeScript tool. And you can use npx. So npx allows you to kind of bring any packages in ad hoc. You're not actually installing them. So here we're going to use the actual TypeScript command line. So you like to initiate a TypeScript config file. And what this does is it creates a tsconfig. And what it's set up inside our actual file explorer. So we do have a tsconfig here. And this is just an initial configuration. And you can go ahead and modify this as you need as you build out your project. And I also recommend kind of going through this tsconfig with your team to kind of have like your team aligned on how TypeScript should work within your application. And again, this is if you're configuring TypeScript in your application for the first time. And the next thing to do is we can actually go and call npx tsc, and we're just going to run watch. So here are the first errors that we're seeing come through. So it's saying that, okay, require is not needed, or we shouldn't have require in a TypeScript file. And that's true because we should be using imports. And this is something that the Node SDK is going to provide us with. And the other thing is we're actually not using Nylas. We're not using the latest version of the actual Nylas Node SDK for V3. So we're switching over to V3. So one thing we're going to do first is how about we go ahead and install the latest Nylas Node SDK package before we continue debugging the TypeScript. So the idea here is as a developer, you're going through and you're bringing in TypeScript, and now you're going to bring in an updated version of an npm package. We're going to do npm install, and we're going to install Nylas at the latest version, and this should be version 7 or greater. So the version 7 of our SDK supports the actual Nylas API v3. So we can go ahead and take a look at our package.json. And in our package.json, we'll see that we have the latest version of the Nylas Node SDK, and this is version 7.10. So if we go ahead and run TypeScript watch, so this is catching all our errors, it's still giving us the same errors. So what we're going to do now is, since it's watching the file, we're going to go back to our actual code editor and start making these updates to see what this should look like, or how can we actually migrate from version 6 of the Node SDK, which is the API version 2 to the actual Node SDK version 7, which represents API version 3 of the Nylas APIs. So I'm going to switch back to the actual code editor. And one thing you'll notice is that we have two files here. So we have a TS, which is Typescript. So this is going to be our source file. And the JavaScript file is actually being built for us. So we don't need to go ahead and touch this. This is actually built by the Typescript compiler. So all we're going to do here is we're going to do a few changes. And the first thing we're going to do is let's just update the import. So we're going to import it's going to be .mconfig. So this allows us to access all our environment variables within our file. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to import Nylas from Nylas. So this is importing the actual Nylas client that we're going to use. And we're going to modify the code here slightly so we can start using or creating a Nylas config. In the Nylas config, I'm going to pass two parameters that we need for the actual Nylas Node SDK. So the first one's going to be the actual key. So this is going to be process environment, and it's going to be the API v3 key. So we're going to be using all v3 environment variables. And the other thing I'm going to add, and this is something I recommend adding, is the actual API v3 URI. So if depending on the region you're in, if you're in the Europe region or the EU region or the North American region, we have different URLs to support data residency. So you can go ahead and get that from our actual documentation on what you need to do. So maybe let me go back here and just pause for 1 second. I just want to kind of pause on what we've done so far. So step one, we went through the Node SDK for the Nylas API v2. And then next, we've actually we've gone ahead and upgraded the Node SDK for the Nylas API v3. So we've done this as well. And as well, we've actually done step 3. We've added TypeScript support. So we've done these a bit out of order where we brought in TypeScript support. We configured our TS config. And now we're going through and starting to look at the errors. And as well, we actually brought in the actual Node SDK for v3. So the step that we're on now is we're actually going to migrate our code from the Nylas API v2 to v3 using the actual Node SDK. So let's go ahead and do that next. So I'm just going to continue Fig. Let me just check. There we go. Yep. So we created the Nylas config. And the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to instantiate Nylas. And how we do that is going to be slightly different. So let me just move this commented code above here. And we're just going to scroll down. We're going to comment this out. And I guess I can show you one thing quickly is when we take a look at this, we notice that the property width does not exist on the type of Nylas. So this is actually telling us some of the migration errors that we'll start seeing when we're migrating from v2 to v3. And what we need to do to actually instantiate the Nylas client is slightly different. So we're going to do Nylas equals Nylas dot, actually new Nylas, and we're going to pass in the Nylas config. So this is actually how we would instantiate the Nylas client or the Nylas SDK within our application. And then we can take a look at some of the implementation errors that we're getting. So in this case, we're being told that limit is not an assignable parameter, and that this function Nylas calendars.list is expecting a list calendars parameter, or the shape should be in one of these, the list calendar parameters, including the query params and any overrides. So you can actually go and click through to see what this should look like. So this will take you to the actual definition or the type definition for the list function on the calendar. And then from there, we can go and take a look at the list calendar params. So here is what it's expecting. So it's expecting two pieces of information. It's expecting the identifier and the query params. So in our case, our identifier is actually a grant ID. So I just want to pause and talk about that for a second. So I don't have a note for that here. Let me take a look. Let me just add that here. But the idea is that the Nylas v3 accepts something called a grant ID. So anytime you have a user that connects and allows your application to access their permissions, you're actually receiving a grant and we represent that grant as a grant ID for the user's permissions. So anytime we need to communicate with the Nylas APIs, we need to pass in the actual grant that represents a user's permissions that they've allowed you to access certain pieces of information, for example, of their Gmail account or their Google Calendar. So the first piece of information that we need to pass in into the SDK is going to be the grant ID. And then the following would be any type of query parameters, such as if we want to limit the amount of information that's sent back to us. So let's go back to the actual code, and we're going to take a look at adding the identifier first. So the identifier I've stored as an environment variable. So I'm going to go back here. So let me comment this out, and I'm just going to do nylas.calendars. And another thing I want to highlight is you do get the advantage of using type ahead. So all the actual properties and functionality is available to you out of the box using the latest version of the Node SDK. So here we're going to go ahead and list, but in the list we're going to pass something different. So we're not actually going to follow the actual Copilot, what it's providing us here. We're going to first pass in the actual identifier. And the identifier is going to be our grant ID. So it's going to be process.m.nylus_v3 user grant ID. So for now, I pass this in as an environment variable, but normally this would be coming from your database. So this would represent a piece of information that comes from your database to represent the grant ID for a specific user. So this is a change from API v2, the Nylas API v2, where we don't normally work with access tokens. You'll notice we're using access tokens for the Nylas v2. In v3, we're focusing on using grants. So the concept of grant ID is what you would be passing in. And then we're going to pass in query parameters. And in this case, we're looking for the first calendars to be returned to us. So one thing I want to mention is that since this is async, I'm just going to throw this inside of a function. So we'll call it an async function. So we'll call it get calendars. And inside of here, I'm just going to take this code and pass it in. So we're going to call get calendars, and I'm just going to shift all this code inside of here, and we're going to return all the calendars. So I'm going to async await on this asynchronous function. I'm just going to console log that information here. Calendars, there we go. And then I'd want to make sure I call this function as well. So what I've done so far is I've created a function get calendars. It's an async await function. So what it's doing is it allows us to await on the actual calendars to be returned. So we're passing in first property of the identifier. So that's the first property we pass in, and then we pass in the query params as an object. So this is an object that we're passing in. And then from there, we're just going to console log the actual result. And one thing we can check as well in our editor, so in Visual Studio Code, I can check if there are any problems here. So if you have any TypeScript errors migrating or anything, for example, if this was spelled incorrectly, I would get an error that it doesn't identify without an R, doesn't exist, and we need to label this as identifier. So this is the benefit of using TypeScript, where you can get an idea of what the shape of your information needs to look like, so you can actually communicate or use that specific SDK. So now that we've gone ahead and migrated this code over from v2 to v3, let's jump into the terminal to see what that looks like. So the first thing we can do is we can just run npx ts TypeScript watch. This shows us that there are no errors found. And then we can actually go ahead and I'm just going to close this, and we can take a look and run our actual node.index.js. So this is our compiled JavaScript from the actual TypeScript. And we'll see that we get back the actual calendars. And it's slightly different in terms of shape, that we get a request ID and then we get an array of calendars under the data property. So this is another change with the SDKs. The format of the data coming back is slightly different, where if we can scroll to the top, I don't think I have it here, but in the past, we actually just had an array of all this information being passed in or passed back from the actual SDK. So here you actually get all the information right away that you can start using and grabbing properties from to do whatever you like with the calendar information. So that is essentially walking through how we can migrate a code sample from v2 to v3. In our example, we did retrieving calendars. So we took the Node SDK for the v2, the Nylas API v2. We brought in Typescript, we brought in the updated Nylas SDK for V3, and we migrated our code over from V2 to V3 using the benefit or the advantage of Typescript, so it can kind of guide us through and identify where we're going to have breaking changes before we actually send that code out to production, or we try to build it or ship a PR on it. So that was the live stream for today. I would definitely encourage everyone to take a look at our blog. So we do have a blog on this that was just released today. So if you go to nylas.com /blog, you can take a look at a blog walking us through with all the code on how to build with Nylas using TypeScript. And as well, I just want to plug our forums. So go to forums.nylas.com. We'd love to hear from you in terms of any questions you have. If you're migrating, any questions you have there, or even if you're using the latest Node or Python or Ruby or Java SDKs, we'd love to see what questions you have, or what are you looking to build with Nylas next. And I think in terms of what's next, I know Blog mentioned this last time, we're going to look at webhooks using Kotlin and Java. So that's going to be coming up next week. So please join us, and I'm sure Blog will be here as well. And that's a live stream. Thanks everyone for joining, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'd love to hear your feedback and comments and any thoughts that you have. So I will see you all next week. Have a great weekend, and bye for now.